When I was a little kid, I remember spending a lot of time fooling around with the boards and tokens from various board games. Don't get me wrong, if there were other people around, I'd much rather play a game, but I also had a lot of lonely hours back then when there wasn't much to do. Actually, I still have a lot of hours like that as an adult, but that's a different story. One of my favorite board games, just to look at and imagine what could be, was the classic murder mystery game Clue. I loved Clue as a kid and wanted to play it all the time, which is funny because I was actually terrible at it. I don't remember winning a single game of Clue in my entire life, but whenever we had a board game night in my house, I found myself hoping that somebody would dust it off. Part of the reason might have been the game's 1985 movie adaptation, which members of my family quoted endlessly back then, and which is still one of my favorite comedies ever. But I think what really drew me to Clue, what made it come alive in a way that set it apart from other board games, was its setting. The Body Mansion doesn't bear much resemblance to any real mansion, yet in spite of the rather detached overhead view the game board provides, it's full of intriguing little details that encourage your mind to wander. Was Mr. Body killed in the kitchen with a lead pipe? How would you kill someone in a kitchen with a lead pipe? Where do you even get a lead pipe in the first place? Do you just, tear it out of the sink? And I get why there's a secret passage from the study to the kitchen. It's like a midnight snack kind of thing. But why is there one from the lounge to the conservatory? Did Mr. Body like to sneak over to the conservatory in the middle of the night to break flower pots or huff pesticide or what? These questions might seem kind of silly, but it's things like this that make Clue fun for me. If the murder that kicks off the events of the game had happened in an apartment, even a rich guy's apartment, it would just be boring. It's because it happens in a big rambling country house that Clue has its central hook, which is the sheer number of different ways Mr. Body could have been killed. But as much as I loved Clue when I was a kid, I have to admit that as mansion stories go, it's about as bare bones as you can possibly get. It is just a board game after all, and there's a reason this isn't a board game review channel. Although... No, focus. Video games. Well, it just so happens that two of my favorite video games remind me a lot of Clue, although they take its basic rich guy mansion setting in two very different directions. It also happens that these games came out for the same console and less than half a year apart. One is the lighthearted Nintendo classic Luigi's Mansion, one of only 3 launch titles for the GameCube, and by far the most fondly remembered one. And the other is the decidedly not lighthearted remake of the game that gave the survival horror genre its name, Capcom's Resident Evil. At first glance, these two games couldn't be more different, despite both technically being in the horror genre and taking place in a big old house. While it lacks the cerebral, atmospheric horror of something like Silent Hill, the original Resident Evil is 100% about scaring the player as much and as often as possible. Combat is tense and frustrating, generally worth avoiding if you have the slightest opportunity to run, and a lot of the challenge revolves around inventory management and knowing when and when not to fight. Now, the original 1996 game did have fairly primitive, bloggy graphics, not to mention a bunch of really cheesy and melodramatic cutscenes, some of which are camp classics to this day. But remember, I'm talking about the GameCube remake here, which not only sold the atmosphere much better than the original, with its impeccably polished pre-rendered interior scenes, but also featured better voice acting and a considerably less silly script. They did keep in the sandwich reference, though. In Luigi's Mansion, on the other hand, the cheesy tone doesn't come from low-resolution character models or dialogue that was badly translated from Japanese. It's deliberate. Luigi's fear and trepidation are often played for laughs, the combat is a lot easier and more fun to engage with than in any survival horror game, and the colorful cast of portrait ghosts you encounter appeals way more to your curiosity than to your fight-or-flight instinct. And yet, as I thought about these two games, what started to draw my attention wasn't the obvious ways in which they're different, but rather the subtle similarities they have, which range from big-picture elements like level structure to even little details like specific set pieces and puzzles. Not only do both of these games remind me of classic mansion stories like Clue, they also remind me of each other. So this Halloween, we're setting foot into the mansion and disturbing the 2 decades of dust that have settled over Luigi's Mansion and Resident Evil, and what we find underneath may just surprise you. Before we dive into what these two games have in common, it might help to establish where each one takes place. Just for future reference, by the way, to simplify things, I'll be referring only to Jill's campaign in Resident Evil. There may be a few additional similarities in Chris's campaign, but I'm less familiar with it, so I'll be leaving it out. Luigi's mansion is set, appropriately enough, in the mansion, a dark green three-gabled Gothic house composed of a large first and second floor, a smaller penthouse-like third story, and a basement. These areas, by the way, are explored in roughly that order. Every room in the house is named, and most of them have a specific function that goes along with their name: kitchen, ballroom, nursery, and so on. Some of the rooms have rather outlandish designs, but most are similar to what you might find in a real-life mansion. Even when they aren't, they tend to be based on aristocratic hobbies, like the safari room and the clockwork room. The rooms are also placed in a more or less realistic arrangement. The kitchen is right next to the dining room. 3 studio and workshop spaces are located on the 3rd floor, where there would be plenty of privacy and quiet. Bathrooms are spaced evenly throughout, and what you might call sleeping quarters are grouped together and away from more public spaces like the parlor and ballroom. I wouldn't say that the mansion is based directly on any real-life model, but it's obvious that whoever designed this place knows what real mansions look like, either from visiting them in real life, or, what I consider more likely, from reading, watching, and playing fiction with this kind of setting. Now, obviously, when I say that the mansion is realistic, that's subject to a hefty amount of suspension of disbelief. There are a lot of gamey aspects to its design, like the fact that every room in the game apparently has its lighting wired up to some room-specific objective you have to complete, or the mirror-based teleportation system, which, as far as I know, isn't something rich people have actually been able to install in real life, though I'm sure they've looked into it. It should probably go without saying that the scarier, more adult Resident Evil has a setting that's much truer to life than the one in Luigi's Mansion. Or should it? Resident Evil takes place in the Spencer Mansion, a rambling, architecturally eclectic but generally Victorian-looking estate located in the forest outside Raccoon City and built for the head of the Umbrella Corporation, Oswald Spencer, by the fictionally famous New York architect George Trevor. Ostensibly a retreat for Spencer and a country club for high-ranking Umbrella executives, the mansion is lavishly decorated and filled with fine art and opulent furniture. While the setting of Luigi's Mansion has a cluttered, lived-in quality that sells its old-world atmosphere, the Spencer Mansion looks more like a tour of Versailles. Apart from the zombies, this place is impressively bright and clean, and consequently doesn't convey much of the personality of its residents. But of course, there's a reason for that, which is that the Spencer Mansion doesn't actually have any residents. And this brings us to the first big setting detail that Luigi's Mansion and the Spencer Mansion have in common. Neither one is actually a real mansion, at least in the sense of a building that serves as a home for a large group of people. In Luigi's Mansion, the house is essentially an illusion created by the portrait ghosts after they escaped from Egad's laboratory, and it disappears into the mist the morning after Luigi recaptures them. As much as it might seem like some of the ghosts are related, canonically they actually come from all over the world and have no connection to each other, except for the coincidence of having been captured by the same guy. Although somehow the money and jewels Luigi collects turn out to be real. Figure that one out. Now, in Resident Evil, the mansion is actually a real building. It's not made of cardboard or anything. But in the most important sense, it's still fake. Spencer never lived there, and all the luxurious furnishings are simply an elaborate distraction from the mansion's true purpose, to serve as a cover for the extensive laboratory underneath the estate, where the Umbrella Corporation researches illegal bioweapons, like the T-virus, for sale to the highest bidder. This artificiality is something that extends to the design of the mansion itself. Unlike Luigi's Mansion, where each room has an obvious and generally unique purpose, a lot of rooms in the Spencer Mansion either don't seem to be for anything at all, or duplicate the function of other rooms that aren't that far away even. It seems like half of the place is made up of hallways, there's like 5 different sitting rooms that look almost identical, and there is a single toilet in the entire house, located on the opposite side of the house from a dining room which could comfortably seat about 20 people, and which is also 2 stories tall for no apparent reason, unless I missed the part where rich people like to stand around on their balconies watching other people eat. This place is frickin' bonkers. The Spencer estate also includes several fairly large outbuildings and separate areas, like the overgrown, bug-infested dormitory, an extensive series of underground caves, and of course the secret laboratory, which constitutes the game's final stretch. Design-wise, there's not much to say about these areas, except that they too don't seem like terribly comfortable places to live, unless you get along really well with spiders, although I have to admit that the lab is a departure, and that it does actually seem to have a realistic layout, considering what its purpose is. So these are our 2 mansions. Both are large, creepy, richly decorated, and feature a lot of weird things. Moving walls and ceilings, death traps, secret passages, and so on. But you would think that's where the similarities would end. After all, the houses are weird and spooky for 2 entirely different reasons. Luigi's Mansion is haunted by ghosts, who are responsible for nearly everything odd that happens, with only a few exceptions. It's never really explained how the observatory works, for instance. In the Spencer Mansion, by contrast, similar weird happenings are mostly caused by mechanical contraptions designed by the architect. There's no ghosts or boogeymen, just humans and various animals infected with a virus that makes them aggressive. Luigi's Mansion is clearly fantasy, while Resident Evil is more like science fiction. But to me, this makes the game's similarities all the more fascinating. Let's start with some basic ones related to the story. First of all, in both games, our protagonists enter the mansion in order to find missing people. Luigi is looking for Mario, and Jill Valentine and company are looking for their comrades in Bravo Team. Also in both games, you run into friendly NPCs who've gotten lost in the mansion and need help. These are Toads in Luigi's Mansion, and in Resident Evil it's, well, the members of Bravo Team. Both games start with a cutscene in which the protagonist is shown as being helpless against the main threat of the game, ghosts and zombies respectively, and has to be saved by an ally with a special weapon, Egad with the Poltergust, and Barry Burton with his Magnum. More noticeable are a few prominent design elements the games share in common. For instance, both games use cutscenes to show doors being opened, and most doors are locked and require a key, though admittedly the placement of keys is very different. In Luigi's Mansion, completing a room often grants you a specific key to a room very close to your current one, while in Resident Evil, keys are more standardized and tend to be spaced farther apart. Both games also have 4 special keys with unique designs which separate distinct parts of the mansion. In Luigi's Mansion, these are the card suit keys that you find after each area boss, while Resident Evil has the sword, shield, armor, and helmet keys. Again, though, there is a critical difference. The keys in Luigi's Mansion are each for one specific door that locks off an entire large area, while the ones in Resident Evil each unlock multiple doors, some located far apart from each other in distant corners of the mansion. And finally, some classic pieces of rich person furniture make an appearance in both games. In fact, just like Clue, both games have a rather prominent pool table in one room. In Resident Evil, this contains a puzzle solution, while in Luigi's Mansion, it's the haunt of portrait ghost Slim Bankshot. Of course, the thing about all these similarities so far is that they could easily be chalked up, no pun intended, to coincidence, or just basic elaboration on the idea of a mansion as a setting. What kind of mansion wouldn't have a piano and a pool table? What kind of video game set in any kind of house wouldn't involve keys and locked doors? As for the story similarities, these would be common tropes in any video game. Looking for missing people is a classic way to get protagonists into a difficult situation. In fact, Luigi's Mansion isn't even the first game in which Luigi is specifically looking for Mario. And the protagonist starting off helpless? That's to sell the threat posed by the creatures you'll be fighting. You see this kind of thing all over the place in video games. Is it possible that all these coincidences just stem from the fact that both Luigi's Mansion and Resident Evil are well-designed? Maybe. But I've got an ace up my sleeve, because the similarities don't end here. If we dig a little deeper into the gameplay and level structure of these games, we find even more, and more intriguing, coincidences. First off, we have the gameplay contrast between hallways and rooms. While there are enemies in many of the rooms in Resident Evil, there are also many rooms with no enemies at all, which focus on puzzle solving instead of combat. Hallways, on the other hand, always contain enemies, and usually very little else. When we turn to Luigi's Mansion, we find the same dynamic. Most areas contain enemies, but the few which don't are all interior rooms, while the hallways remain a constant threat filled with respawning ghosts. Unlike the rooms, which can be lit up and made safe by completing an objective, hallways remain dangerous until the entire area is finished. There are also specific places in the two games that not only resemble each other, but are also explored at around the same point in the story. Luigi's Mansion, for instance, has an enormous cemetery, way bigger than any individual family would actually need, just behind the house, which you explore a little before the halfway point of the game. It's where you fight the second area boss. And what a surprise! Resident Evil also has a large cemetery right behind the house, which you end up exploring about halfway through the game, right after the initial run through the main mansion, and just before entering the dormitory. How about that underground altar just before you enter the secret lab where you have the boss fight against Lisa Trevor? Sure is spooky. I bet there's nothing like this in Luigi's Mansion, right? Actually, there is. It's right at the end of the game, it's literally called the Secret Altar, and you fight a boss there. Also, in both cases, there's a dead person in the middle of the room. Yeah, I know, that doesn't really count. Both games also have a final boss fight on the roof of the mansion. Okay, you might call this cheating too, because technically the fight that starts at the secret altar and the fight that ends on the roof are the same boss fight, but still, it's weird, isn't it? But surely I can't be saying that these games are more alike than they are different, right? I mean, Resident Evil is a proper survival horror game. It's tense and unnerving. And Luigi's Mansion, it's for kids. There's no real scares to be found in it. I mean, think back to the second time you visit the main mansion in Resident Evil, when all the zombies get replaced by super fast hunters who can kill you in 2 hits. It's so nerve-wracking trying to make your way to the secret lab. You have to constantly worry about your health, and you never really feel safe. Luigi's Mansion never gets close to that level. Right? It does, though. It totally does. Maybe you've forgotten about the part of Luigi's Mansion where lightning strikes the mansion's roof and plunges the entire building into pitch darkness. You know, the part that happens right at the beginning of the final area of the game, and the only part of the game where you're not safe no matter where you go, and the enemies you fought before are replaced by bigger and badder ones, and since nothing you do turns the lights back on, you have to constantly watch your back and can't let your guard down for a second until you make it to the basement, which, and maybe this is a complete coincidence, is under the house in almost exactly the same place as the secret lab in Resident Evil?
Ooh, it is a mystery.
Okay, I'm not being totally 100% serious here. The truth is that a big part of the reason why this is such a memorable moment in Luigi's Mansion is because it contrasts so sharply with the rest of the game. The compartmentalized nature of the rooms in Luigi's Mansion means that, more often than not, any tension you get from the game's challenge will be relieved in a few minutes. That's the complete opposite of the effect that Resident Evil's gameplay has on people. In that game, you're constantly scurrying from one room to another, and neither one of them is finished in the same way you can finish a room in Luigi's Mansion. You're always under the gun in Resident Evil, always anticipating the next zombie jumping through a window or crawling out of a toilet or whatever other awful thing they do. This is basically the essence of survival horror, this constantly keeping the player on edge. And honestly, that's a big reason why I think I like Luigi's Mansion more. If you think of scariness as being like musical dynamics, Luigi's Mansion is like a quiet pop song that every so often catches you off guard with a high-energy blast of volume. Resident Evil is like an industrial song that starts off loud and only cranks it up from there, with very few moments of relative quiet. I mentioned in a previous Halloween video that scary moments in non-horror games actually appeal to me a lot more than the scariest moments in horror games. Even though Luigi's Mansion is technically a horror game, it's so chill and unthreatening most of the time that it manages to create the same effect when it finally takes the gloves off and gets scary. It's in these moments that it's the most like Resident Evil psychologically, despite the obvious differences in gameplay and presentation. Ask yourself this: what's scarier, staring at a super detailed and super gory Halloween mask for 5 minutes, or spending 5 minutes folding your laundry and then having a friend suddenly turn all the lights off and poke you in the back of the neck? Which one you pick probably says a lot about whether you'd enjoy Resident Evil or Luigi's Mansion more. Because just as Luigi's Mansion occasionally elevates itself to Resident Evil levels of scariness, Resident Evil can occasionally feel just as childish as Luigi's Mansion, despite its darker and more mature tone. They sort of meet in the middle. Luigi's Mansion is a silly premise that's improved somewhat by a grounded and believable setting, while Resident Evil is a serious premise dragged down to the level of camp by ridiculous and artificial contrivances. The fact that two games like this can be so similar and yet so different speaks to the flexibility of a mansion, haunted or otherwise, as a setting. This is one of the things I love about haunted house stories, the fact that you can start with a basic premise and go in so many unique directions with it. A game set in a mansion can be bleak and scary like Alone in the Dark, or philosophical like What Remains of Edith Finch, or even goofy and lighthearted like Quantum Conundrum. A big house full of old stuff may seem like a simplistic premise, but there's so much you can do with it, and I don't think we're even close to exhausting the potential it has for storytelling. When I think back to my childhood fascination with Clue, it's obvious that it had nothing to do with the game's actual rules or mechanics. I sucked at Clue. If the game itself had been all there was to it, I would have found it boring. What I loved about it was the story it told, and the stories I imagined while playing it. Clue may be a game about murder, but just like a classic mystery novel, it takes that grim concept and surrounds it with the fun of letting your imagination run free. And isn't that what Halloween is all about? To send off the occasion properly, let's celebrate by taking a tour through all the rooms in Clue, by which I of course mean the rooms in Luigi's Mansion and Resident Evil. Oh, and while I have your attention... Boo!